On a quiet day when the world feels heavier than usual, there comes a moment when a person feels the need to begin again. Not by running away, not by adding more noise, but by returning to simplicity. There is a forgotten wisdom in stillness, and in the smallest of acts clarity can be restored. On the 12th day of May, as the energy of the season shifts and the air carries both warmth and restlessness, there is a practice that has been passed through gentle hands and quiet generations. It is not about superstition, but about attention. It is not about fear, but about awareness. It begins with something simple: salt. Salt has always been more than a substance. It preserves, it purifies, it reminds. In ancient understanding, it is a symbol of protection and balance. When used with intention, it becomes a mirror for the mind, reflecting what is heavy and what is pure. The practice begins in silence. A person stands in the center of their space, not as a ruler of it, but as a witness. The home is not only walls and objects, it is an extension of thought, memory, and emotion. Every corner holds something unseen. Some of it is light, some of it is burdened by stress, argument, worry, or forgotten sorrow. With calm awareness, a small pinch of salt is held in the hand. Not rushed, not scattered carelessly, but offered with presence. One moves slowly to each of the 4 corners: north, south, east, and west, not as directions alone, but as symbols of wholeness. Each corner represents an aspect of life: beginnings, endings, stability, and change. At the first corner, there is a pause. Breath becomes steady. The salt is placed gently, as if placing down an old thought no longer needed. In that moment, there is no demand for change, only the quiet invitation for release. At the second corner, the same gesture is repeated. But now there is awareness of what has been carried unnecessarily: old worries, unspoken tension, lingering impressions of yesterday. The salt does not erase life, it acknowledges it and then allows space around it. At the third corner, the mind begins to soften. The act becomes less about doing and more about observing. One notices how the body responds to stillness. The breath feels less burdened. The space feels less crowded, not because anything visible has changed, but because attention has shifted. At the fourth corner, something subtle happens. There is acceptance. Not everything can be controlled, not everything must be held. The salt becomes a symbol of letting the unseen settle, like dust finally allowed to rest on the ground instead of floating endlessly in the air of thought. When the circle is complete, there is no dramatic transformation. The walls remain the same. The objects remain where they were. But the perception has shifted. The space feels slightly lighter, as if the mind has stopped pressing so heavily against it. One does not leave this practice believing that salt has magical power. Rather, one understands that intention has power. Awareness has power. The human mind, when focused fully on a simple act, can reorganize the way it experiences its surroundings. The salt in the 4 corners becomes a reminder. Just as the home can be tended to, so too can the inner world. Thoughts that gather in hidden corners of the mind can be observed, acknowledged, and released with the same gentleness. And so this ritual is not about superstition or certainty. It is about returning to presence. It is about remembering that clarity does not always come from adding more, but often from gently letting go. In the days that follow, one may forget the salt, but the awareness remains. The 4 corners become symbolic of the self, where thoughts begin, where they settle, where they transform, and where they are finally allowed to rest. Salt as a symbol of awareness and purification. Salt is used not as magic, but as a symbol of intention, clarity, and emotional cleansing, helping the mind focus on releasing heaviness. Salt in this understanding is not treated as an object of superstition or fear, but as a simple reminder of clarity and intention. It is something that has existed in human life for centuries, not only as a part of food, but also as a symbol of preservation and balance. When a person holds it with awareness, even a small pinch becomes meaningful. The act is not about the material itself, but about the mind that uses it. In that moment, attention gathers and scattered thoughts begin to settle, as if the mind finally has a point to rest upon. When this practice begins, the person does not rush. There is no need for urgency, because urgency belongs to confusion, and this is a practice of clarity. Standing quietly, one becomes aware of the space they inhabit. A home is often seen as walls, furniture, and objects, but in truth it also carries emotional memory. Every room holds traces of laughter, silence, stress, and thought. Without realizing it, people absorb these impressions daily. The salt becomes a gentle way of acknowledging this unseen layer of life. Moving toward the first corner, there is a pause. In that pause, awareness deepens. The mind notices how often it moves without direction during the day, how many thoughts pass without being seen. Placing salt in the corner is like marking a point of awareness, saying silently that here, the process of release begins. Nothing is forced. Nothing is resisted. It is simply observed and allowed. At the second corner, the understanding becomes slightly clearer. One begins to recognize that much of what weighs on the mind is not physical but mental repetition, worries replayed, conversations remembered, expectations carried. The salt placed here does not remove these thoughts by force. Instead, it symbolizes acknowledgement. When something is truly seen, it naturally begins to lose its grip. The act is simple, yet it quietly changes the relationship one has with their inner noise. By the time the third corner is reached, something subtle shifts. The body feels less tense, the breath becomes softer, and attention is no longer scattered. There is a growing sense that stillness is not something far away to be achieved, but something already present beneath the surface of thought. The salt again is placed with care, but now the movement feels less like a task and more like a reflection. It is as if the mind is learning to slow down by observing itself slowing down. At the fourth corner there is a quiet completion. Not an ending in the dramatic sense, but a gentle closing of a circle. The act of placing salt here feels like setting down the last piece of mental weight that was unconsciously carried. There is no expectation that everything in life will change instantly. Instead, there is a recognition that space has been created, space within the room and within the mind. When the practice is finished, the home remains the same, yet perception has shifted. The silence feels deeper, not because sound has disappeared, but because attention has softened. This is the subtle power of mindful action. It does not depend on belief, but on presence. It reminds a person that peace is not always something to be searched for in distant places. Sometimes it is revealed in the simplest, most ordinary gestures when done with full awareness. The four corners represent balance in life. Each corner of the space symbolizes different aspects of life: beginnings, endings, stability, and change, creating a sense of wholeness. As the practice continues to unfold in understanding, it becomes clear that this simple movement around the four corners is not about changing the outer world, but about transforming the way the inner world relates to it. Salt in this sense acts as a quiet teacher. It does not speak, it does not explain, yet it invites awareness. When a person holds it with intention, even briefly, it interrupts the usual flow of distraction and brings attention back to the present moment. In that return, something often overlooked becomes visible. The mind is always shaping the experience of space, even when we are not aware of it. When standing in the center of a room, a person is actually standing in the center of their own mental projection of that space. Thoughts, emotions, memories, and expectations are constantly coloring how the environment feels. A room can feel heavy or light, not because of its physical structure, but because of the mental state carried within it. This is why the act of moving slowly to each corner becomes meaningful. It is not the corners themselves that are being changed, but the attention that is being refined through them. At the second stage of the movement, awareness begins to deepen beyond surface observation. The simple action of placing salt becomes a way of noticing how much the mind resists silence. Even in quiet environments, thoughts tend to continue their movement, often without direction or purpose. By gently engaging in a slow, mindful action, the mind is given something simple to rest upon. This creates a break in the habitual cycle of mental noise. In that break, clarity is not forced, it naturally appears, like water settling when agitation stops. As the practice reaches the midpoint, a subtle realization arises. Most of what is carried mentally does not need to be carried at all. The mind often stores emotional residue from conversations, unfinished tasks, imagined outcomes, and remembered discomfort. These do not exist in the present moment, yet they continue to influence it. The act of moving from corner to corner becomes a symbolic release of this unnecessary burden. Each placement of salt is like setting down a weight that was never truly essential. With continued awareness, the experience begins to shift from doing into simply being. The body moves, but the mind observes. The hands act, but the awareness remains still. This separation between action and observation creates a quiet space inside consciousness where peace is no longer something distant or idealized. It is simply what remains when unnecessary mental activity is reduced. The salt, unchanged in itself, becomes a focal point for this recognition. It shows that transformation does not always require complexity, sometimes it requires simplicity practiced with sincerity. By the later stages of the process, the idea of cleansing takes on a deeper meaning. It is no longer about removing something external, but about allowing internal clarity to surface. Just as dust settles when movement in a room stops, thoughts settle when attention becomes steady. The four corners begin to represent not just physical space, but the structure of awareness itself, where thought arises, where it pauses, where it shifts, and where it returns to stillness. When the practice is complete, nothing dramatic has occurred on the surface. Yet internally there is often a noticeable shift. The mind feels less crowded, not because problems have disappeared, but because the relationship to them has changed. There is more space to observe without immediate reaction. In this space, a quieter form of understanding becomes available, one that does not rely on explanation, but on direct experience of calm presence within ordinary life. Mindful movement creates inner stillness. The slow, intentional act of placing salt in each corner encourages awareness, calm breathing, and present moment attention. As this understanding deepens further, the meaning of the four corners begins to extend beyond the physical space of a room and becomes a reflection of the inner architecture of human experience. Every person carries an unseen structure within the mind, where thoughts arise, emotions settle, memories linger, and intentions form. This inner space is rarely still. It is constantly influenced by the events of daily life, and without awareness it becomes crowded with impressions that are never fully processed. The simple act of moving with intention through a space using salt becomes a way of gently observing this internal landscape without judgment. When attention is placed on the first corner, there is often an unconscious recognition of beginnings, not only the beginning of the ritual, but the beginning of awareness itself. Most of the time, life is lived in reaction rather than observation. Thoughts appear and the mind follows them immediately. But here in this quiet movement, there is a pause between stimulus and response. That pause is significant because within it lies the possibility of clarity. The salt placed at this point symbolizes the willingness to begin seeing life without rushing into interpretation. The second corner, awareness, starts to expand. It becomes more evident that the mind carries layers of unfinished emotional activity. These are not always strong or dramatic feelings, but subtle impressions, slight tensions, small regrets, quiet anxieties. They remain because they are not acknowledged. In placing salt here, the action becomes a form of recognition, not approval or rejection, but simple acknowledgement. And in that acknowledgement, something begins to loosen. The mind does not need to fight its own contents, it only needs to see them clearly. By the time the third corner is reached, there is often a shift in perception. The sense of separation between the practitioner and the practice begins to fade. It is no longer I am doing something to the space, but rather I am observing the space as it reflects my own state. This subtle change is important. It transforms the ritual from an external action into an internal reflection. The salt becomes secondary, awareness becomes primary. In this stage, even silence feels different. It is no longer empty, but full of subtle presence. At the fourth corner, the experience often becomes more spacious. The act of placing salt here can feel like completing a circle of attention. Yet completion does not mean finality, it means integration. What was observed in fragments now begins to feel whole. The mind, which is usually scattered across past and future, is gently drawn into the present moment. There is no need to analyze or interpret this state. It is enough to notice it. In that noticing, a quiet stability arises that does not depend on external conditions. After the movement is finished, the room remains unchanged in its physical form, but the perception of it may feel different. The corners are still corners, yet they now hold a sense of awareness that was not noticed before. This is because attention has been trained, even briefly, to see more clearly. The salt itself is not responsible for this change, it simply serves as a point of focus, a reminder that intention shapes experience. Over time, this practice becomes less about ritual and more about recognition. The four corners begin to symbolize the continuous movement of the mind, how it begins, reacts, observes, and settles. And in understanding this cycle, a person starts to realize that peace is not something added to life, but something revealed when unnecessary mental movement slows down. Letting go of emotional and mental burdens, the ritual represents releasing stress, negative thoughts, and emotional residue that silently accumulate in daily life. As the understanding of this practice matures, it becomes less about a single moment of ritual and more about a way of seeing life itself. The movement through the four corners with salt is no longer experienced as an isolated act, but as a reflection of how consciousness naturally operates throughout the day. Thoughts arise, settle, shift direction, and dissolve, much like the journey from one corner to another. In this way, the simple act becomes a mirror for the continuous movement of the mind. At a deeper level, the first corner begins to represent awareness of origin, not only of the ritual, but of every thought and emotional reaction that arises in daily life. Most people rarely observe where their thoughts begin. They appear so quickly that they feel automatic. Yet when attention becomes more refined, it becomes possible to notice the subtle moment just before reaction takes shape. Placing salt at this point symbolizes recognition of that origin. It is an acknowledgement that every mental movement has a starting point, and that starting point can be observed rather than unconsciously followed. Moving toward the second corner, the experience often reveals the accumulation of mental continuity. Thoughts do not exist in isolation, they connect, repeat, and build patterns. A single worry can extend itself into many forms. A single memory can shape the mood of an entire day. At this stage, placing salt is not about removing these patterns, but about seeing them clearly enough that they no longer operate unnoticed. Clarity itself begins to weaken their influence. What is seen fully loses its hidden power. By the time the third corner is reached, awareness often becomes more spacious. There is a growing recognition that the mind is not confined to its thoughts. Beneath all mental activity, there is a field of awareness that remains unchanged regardless of what appears within it. This realization is subtle and does not depend on belief. It is discovered through attention. The act of moving slowly, deliberately, and without distraction allows this underlying stillness to become more noticeable. The salt placed here becomes less important than the quality of presence with which it is placed. The fourth corner, something quietly completes itself. It is not the completion of a task, but the completion of a cycle of attention. The mind, which is usually fragmented across many directions, experiences a brief sense of wholeness. Not because everything is resolved, but because everything is simply seen as it is. In this moment, there is no need to change anything. The practice has already done its work by shifting awareness from unconscious reaction to conscious observation. When the movement ends, the space feels subtly different, not because the environment has transformed, but because perception has softened. The corners remain where they have always been, yet they now carry a sense of presence that was previously unnoticed. This change is not external but internal. It reflects a shift in the relationship between observer and environment. Over time, this practice extends beyond the physical act. The four corners begin to appear in everyday life, in conversations, in decisions, in emotional responses. There is a beginning, an unfolding, an observation, and a settling. Recognizing this pattern brings a quiet stability to experience. Life is no longer seen as a series of uncontrolled events, but as a flow that can be observed with steadiness. In this understanding, salt is no longer just salt and corners are no longer just corners. They become reminders that clarity does not come from controlling life, but from seeing it fully, moment by moment, without resistance. Outer space reflects inner state. Cleaning and calming the physical environment mirrors the process of organizing and calming the mind, leading to a sense of mental lightness and peace. At the deepest level of this understanding, the practice becomes less about movement, objects, or even symbolism, and more about the direct experience of awareness itself. The four corners are no longer simply points in a physical room, they begin to represent the totality of lived experience. Every human life moves through unseen corners of perception, moments of beginning, moments of response, moments of reflection, and moments of release. When this is seen clearly, even ordinary actions begin to carry quiet significance. In the beginning of the cycle, awareness is often scattered. The mind moves quickly from one impression to another, rarely pausing long enough to fully understand what it is experiencing. This is the condition in which most people live without noticing it. Thoughts appear, emotions arise, and actions follow almost automatically. The introduction of a simple, deliberate act such as placing salt in a corner interrupts this automatic flow. Not by force, but by invitation. It invites attention to slow down just enough to notice itself. As the second phase unfolds, the practice reveals how deeply conditioned patterns shape perception. Much of what is felt in any moment is not new, it is repeated mental material shaped by past experiences. These patterns quietly influence how spaces feel, how situations are interpreted, and how emotions are sustained. The slow movement toward each corner becomes a way of observing these patterns without becoming entangled in them. The salt in this sense is not a tool of change but a point of recognition. It marks the moment where unconscious repetition becomes conscious observation. In the third phase, something more subtle begins to emerge. As attention stabilizes, there is a growing awareness that the mind is not identical to its content. Thoughts come and go, but the awareness that notices them remains unchanged. This realization is not intellectual, it is experiential. It arises naturally when attention is steady and unforced. In this stage, the act of moving through the space becomes less important than the quality of presence that accompanies it. Each step feels lighter, not because anything external has changed, but because identification with mental noise begins to soften. By the time the fourth corner is reached, there is often a sense of quiet integration. The cycle of observation feels complete, not in a final or absolute sense, but in the sense that attention has returned to its source. What was previously fragmented across different directions of thought now feels gathered into a single field of awareness. The salt placed here is not an ending, but a gentle acknowledgement that everything observed has been seen without resistance. After the movement concludes, the space remains unchanged in appearance, yet perception may feel more open. This openness is not created, it is uncovered. It was always present beneath the layers of distraction and mental activity. The practice simply reveals it by reducing unnecessary inner movement. Over time, this recognition begins to extend beyond the ritual itself. Daily life starts to reflect the same structure. Beginnings are noticed more clearly, reactions are observed more calmly, reflections arise with greater honesty, and letting go becomes more natural. Eventually, even the idea of corners becomes symbolic rather than literal. Every moment becomes a corner opportunity to observe the movement of mind without being swept away by it. In this way, the simple act of salt and space transforms into a quiet training in awareness. It does not promise change through effort, but through seeing. And in that seeing, life gradually becomes less crowded, not because there is less happening, but because there is more understanding of what is happening.